Suzanne Valadon rose from abject poverty to become one of the most acclaimed artists in France, at a time when few women were taken seriously. From acrobat and stunt rider, she switched to modelling for some of the most famous names in Impressionist art, before deciding to have a go herself, creating her own unique style and transforming the way the female body was represented. Welcome to Insane History. I'm Graham Yorston, and today I'm exploring the colourful life of French artist Suzanne Valadon. A woman who painted from instinct, who transcended different styles and movements, who refused to be defined and yet won the respect of the art world, and a trailblazer for women choosing to lead their lives the way they wanted. Suzanne Valadon was born Marie Clémentine Valadon in 1865 in Bessines-sur-Gartempe, a village in the Limousin region, 200 miles south of Paris, an area of grand chateaux, porcelain factories and rural poverty. Her mother, Madeleine, was a widow who worked as a live-in seamstress for a prosperous family. Her husband had died in prison, leaving her with several children to support, but she took little interest in them, or anything very much, and had few friends, so the village was shocked when she became pregnant. She refused to name the father, but many years later claimed she had been seduced by a miller who was then crushed to death in an accident as punishment for his sins. The birth of her illegitimate daughter meant that she had to leave her simple but comfortable life in the countryside, and like many others she headed to Paris, settling in the shabby, low-rent area of Montmartre, a district that would become the beating heart of artistic life in the city. France under Emperor Napoleon III was undergoing rapid modernisation and imperial expansion, bringing in money and work. But Madeleine didn't want to slave away for a pittance in a dingy sweatshop, cheek by jowl with other women, so she chose instead to work scrubbing floors, leaving her daughter with the wife of her concierge. Madeleine managed to get her daughter into the convent school of Saint-Vincent de Paul as a day pupil, where Marie, as she was still called, was taught to read and write and, more importantly, fed. But in 1870, the ambitious emperor's desire to reassert French dominance in continental Europe led to a disastrous war with Prussia, and after only 2 months the Prussians had inflicted humiliating defeats on the French army, captured the emperor, and were besieging Paris to starve it into surrender. Fresh meat ran out after a month, so first horses, then cats and dogs appeared on the menu, even rats, and finally all the animals in the zoo, including the 2 elephants Castor and Pollux. In January the following year, the Prussians began a month-long artillery bombardment which forced 20,000 Parisians from their homes. And then, in March 1871, the radical Paris Commune was established, seeking to force a better deal for working people, only to be bloodily suppressed 2 months later, with thousands being killed in the conflict and the savage reprisals afterwards. The sisters in the convent were terrified. They refused to open the gates to anyone, leaving the 5-year-old Marie to fend for herself on the streets. Somehow, in the midst of all this turmoil and bloodshed, Madeleine Valadon and her daughter managed to survive, and when everything died down, Marie was able to return to school, whilst her disillusioned mother turned to brandy. But little Marie had been given a taste of freedom, and she skipped classes to charge around the streets with other urchins, turning cartwheels and acrobatic tricks, bantering with workmen and hanging around with lowlifes, prostitutes and criminals. At home she loved to sketch, but her mother took little notice until she drew herself and her friends, mostly boys, with no clothes on. Her mother beat her soundly, which simply made the rebellious girl go out and make the same rude chalk drawings on the pavements of Montmartre. Barefoot, relishing her ragged clothes and unwashedness, she was a real wild child, striding around the streets as if she owned them. She had a fierce temper and was known as the Little Valadon Terror, exploding into rages, attacking anyone and everyone who dared to challenge her with her nails or throwing rotten fruit, stones or anything else within reach, and screaming out language that would make a sailor blush. The nuns did their best to get her to stay and finish her schooling, but eventually gave her up as a lost cause. And so, before her 10th birthday, she had to enter the world of work. She managed 3 years in the crowded back room of a milliner, occasionally escaping through a window for an afternoon's freedom, before finally running away for good. She then worked as a dishwasher, sold vegetables at a market stall, and as a groom at a livery stable, taking out the heavy Percheron horses into the streets for exercise, riding bareback and performing handstands on their backs to the amusement of passers-by. All of which got her noticed at the age of 14 by Ernest Mollier, proprietor of the Cirque Mollier, a private circus that featured a mixture of professional and aristocratic performers, showing off their equestrian and other talents for a well-heeled and fashionable audience of the Paris elite. Valadon stood on horses, galloping around the ring, balanced on tightropes, and wowed the spectators with her acrobatic feats, and probably also had to take part in Moliere's private pantomimes. No prizes for guessing what they entailed. But after 6 months, while rehearsing a trapeze routine, she fell and injured her back, and that was the end of her circus career. Moliere soon found someone else to replace her. Paris was full of women wanting a moment of fame, one of whom succeeded rather well by introducing a risque exotic dance routine, Mata Hari. But Valadon had to find something else to do. By now, Montmartre was full of artists, all trying to make a name for themselves and attract wealthy buyers. One of the most popular subjects being the female nude, for which they needed a ready supply of willing young models. Legend has it that the young Valadon was sent by her mother to deliver a basket of laundry to the 57-year-old Pierre Puvis de Chavannes, who was searching for fresh talent to pose for his dreamy symbolist paintings. Struck by her beauty, he immediately took her on as a model, and as a lover, and she lived in his luxurious apartment for 6 months, until she left. We don't know if she got bored with him, or he was exhausted by her, but she returned to her mother's dingy room and her life of café camaraderie, cabarets, and a new lover every week. For all her fiery nature, there was something about her carefree personality that was irresistible. Every artist wanted to paint her, and most wanted something more. And the teenage Valadon was not shy about sharing her charms, making her one of the most sought-after young ladies in Montmartre. She posed for Gustave Wertheimer, Jean-Jacques Henner, and Hector Leroux, and for drawings by illustrators Jean-Louis Forain and Théophile Steinlen. And she had affairs with the Italian Impressionist Federico Zandomeneghi, a Breton waiter, and a postman called Leconte, amongst others, often brief and often overlapping. At 18, she became a regular model for Pierre-Auguste Renoir, who, despite being reasonably well off from the sale of his paintings, preferred to live in the more vibrant area of Montmartre. Valadon and Renoir would be seen strolling along arm in arm, and nobody was in any doubt that they were lovers. She posed for Renoir's paintings Dance at Bougival and Dance in the City, but not for the companion piece Dance in the Country, for which the model was Aline Charigot, who later bore Renoir 3 sons and became Mrs. Renoir. But just after starting to work for Renoir, Valadon became pregnant, and like her mother, she refused to name the father. Naturally, there was gossip and speculation. Was it Puvis de Chavannes, Zandomeneghi, Renoir, or the flamboyant painter and engineer Miguel Utrillo she met at the Chat Noir Cabaret? When asked, she just shrugged and said, "I've never been able to decide." But later in life, when her son's mental health problems were apparent, she claimed the father was an unsavoury accountant by the name of Adrien Boissy, who had forced himself upon her after a drunken ladies' night at the Moulin de la Galette. By this time, Boissy was dead, having spent his final years living in a dustbin behind an ironmonger's shop, so he was unavailable for comment. Her son was born in December, after a long and difficult labour that ended in a forceps delivery, and her being in a coma for 2 days. She named him Maurice, as this was one of the few names she did not have a connection with. But she had to get back to work, so left him in the care of her mother. Around this time, Renoir discovered Valadon working on a drawing. "Ah, you too," he said, impressed. "And you hide this talent?" But he went no further. He did not ask to see more of her work, or encourage her in any way, and never mentioned her drawing again. Later, Valadon said she was convinced Renoir was jealous of her natural ability to create vivid, dynamic lines, in contrast to his own effortful technique. But rather than discouraging her, it spurred her on, as it made her realise she really was an artist. The following year, she met the 20-year-old Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec. From one of France's oldest and grandest families, fractures of his right femur at the age of 13 and left the following year had resulted in his legs failing to grow further. Doctors at the time were baffled, and even today it is not clear what condition he had, possibly pycnodysostosis or some other genetic bone disorder. The condition left him only 5 feet tall, with an adult torso on child-sized legs and a shuffling gait, and according to cabaret singer Yvette Gilbert, a nose big enough for 2 faces. But he was a lively, eternally optimistic personality with an urge to experience everything Belle Époque France had to offer, and the wealth to fund it. Valadon posed for him and became the unofficial hostess of his lavish dinner parties, and Toulouse-Lautrec gave her the nickname Suzanne, after the biblical story of Susanna and the elders, a popular subject in art of a respectable young woman falsely accused by lecherous old men, lusting after her unattainable beauty. Toulouse-Lautrec was one of the first to fully appreciate her artistic talents. He bought some of her drawings and hung them in his studio, asking visitors to guess the artist and happily telling them the truth when they suggested some of the greatest names in art. They became lovers, and despite being only a year older, Toulouse-Lautrec took a paternal role, giving her advice on how to deal with her mother, what to do about educating her son, what she should eat, even what she should wear. And for the first time Valadon began to listen, and not feel she had to do the opposite. And although Lautrec was enthusiastic about her work, he was conscious that he was still an unknown in the art world, and she needed the approval of a more established figure, so he suggested she show her work to Edgar Degas. When she nervously opened her portfolio for Degas to squint at with his failing eyes, he inspected her drawings for what seemed an eternity, then turned to the young woman standing before him and solemnly declared, "Yes, it is true. You are indeed one of us." It was the beginning of a lasting friendship. The ageing Degas could no longer take part in the bohemian nightlife of Paris, but he loved hearing all the latest gossip from the little she-devil Maria, and loved even more her bold and unaffected drawing style, buying many of her pictures and encouraging her to exhibit. She was still seeing Toulouse-Lautrec, but their relationship was not an easy one. His alcoholism was beginning to get out of control. He had, after all, invented his own tipple, the earthquake cocktail, half absinthe, half cognac. And her novelty-seeking nature and disappearing off for days at a time would throw him into despair, and they finally parted in 1888, after much drama and threats to end it all. Her spirits soon lifted when Maurice Utrillo arrived back in Paris, and they resumed their affair. By now her son Maurice was 5, and it was becoming clear that he had some serious issues. Quiet and painfully shy, he had facial tics and had several seizures after a bout of gastroenteritis. At times he would suddenly erupt into unexplained fits of rage and throw things around the room, and then hold his breath until he turned blue. These could have been simple febrile convulsions and breath-holding episodes, or some form of epilepsy related to birth trauma. The doctors at the time told her he would grow out of it. But Suzanne, as she now called herself, was so busy with her artistic and social life she had little time to spend with her son, and she didn't know what to do with him when he was having one of his rages. His grandmother's solution was effective, but just stored up trouble for later, giving him watered-down wine. Suzanne thought her son might benefit from having a father figure around, so when a wealthy young banker, Paul Moussy, appeared on the scene, she was interested. He was a regular at the cafes and cabarets, mingling with the artists and writers, and became accepted as one of their own through his generosity in keeping the alcohol flowing. Moussy was immediately besotted, and within a few weeks he had proposed marriage. She declined, but agreed to become his lover, as this way she would be on equal terms with him, whereas if she married him, she would be subservient. Moussy offered her financial stability, but he was certainly not her master. And only 3 months into their relationship, Valadon met the enigmatic new pianist at Le Chat Noir, Erik Satie. Satie was a crushingly poor young composer with a very quirky personality. Nowadays he would probably be labelled as being on the autistic spectrum, but at the time people just thought he was a bit strange. As soon as he met Valadon, he could think of nothing else. He asked her to marry him within an hour of meeting her, informing her in his uniquely offbeat way that "I breathe with care, a little at a time, and I dance very rarely." She turned him down, but found him fascinating, and they soon became lovers, with Moussy standing by bemused but powerless to stop her. Satie gave her a necklace of sausages, took her to the Luxembourg Gardens to sail toy boats. He sent her a son an enormous funeral wreath so that he could learn the names of the flowers and make up better ones. Satie didn't seem to mind that she was still seeing Moussy, and he took them both to the theatre, arranging for 2 drummer boys to march before them, all like royalty, and for her birthday he gave her a paper sack with all the wonderful smells of the world in it. Valadon had never met anyone quite like him. She loved his idiosyncrasies and unexpected gestures, and constantly fussed over him and mothered him, feeding him, fixing his clothes and darning his socks, and cleaning his squalid little room. Eventually, Moussy grew tired of the ménage à trois and told Suzanne it had to end. When she refused, he went off in a huff. But he couldn't stay away, and when he returned 6 months later, it was Satie's turn to complain and demand exclusivity. So Suzanne put an end to their relationship, leaving Satie so distraught he never had another lover as long as he lived. Still feeling her son needed a father figure, she asked Maurice Utrillo, who, after some time and a lot of persuasion, agreed to sign an act of recognition naming himself as the father. He joked that he was happy to sign his name to the work of Renoir or Puvis de Chavannes, but little Maurice bore a striking resemblance to the Catalan and had many of his temperamental quirks. But whether he was or wasn't the father, he didn't contribute much, leaving Suzanne to struggle on as best she could as a single mother. Suzanne and Moussy set up house together in the Rue Courteau, and people began to call her Madame Moussy. But there are no records that show they were ever officially married. They lived just 2 doors away from Erik Satie in his lonely garret, and Suzanne visited him there to paint her first oil portrait. And Erik reciprocated by sketching her. Moussy eventually grew tired of the bohemian excesses of Montmartre, and seeking a lifestyle more befitting a bourgeois banker, decided to lease a house in the village of Pierrefitte, 20 kilometres north of Paris, as a weekend retreat for himself, Suzanne, her mother and Maurice. Madeleine, now in her 60s, crippled by rheumatism and permanently pickled in brandy, was delighted to get out of the city which she'd never liked. Maurice still suffered from rapidly changing moods and temper outbursts, and his grandmother could only control his rages with wine. Now undiluted, but rather than calming him down, it often led to him demanding more, until he eventually passed out. He had been turned into an alcoholic at the age of 9. In 1894, Degas suggested that Suzanne submit her work to the Salon de la Société Nationale des Beaux-Arts. the most prestigious exhibition hall in Paris. It was unheard of for the Société to show the work of an untrained lower-class woman, or any woman for that matter. But with the combined recommendations of Degas and sculptor Albert Bartholomé, 5 of Valadon's drawings were accepted. There were some, however, who were outraged, and she was jostled as she tried to enter the building. After 2 years of cosy domesticity, Moussy decided to build a new family home in the country. Suzanne was still unsure about a permanent move from the city, but Moussy persuaded her that to achieve her true potential as an artist, she needed to move away from the chaos of Montmartre, but agreed that she should keep her studio in the Rue Courtauld. Soon, the wild child of Montmartre, the ungovernable she-devil, began to appreciate the quieter life of Montmagny and started to enjoy gardening. But she could not ignore the ever-increasing problems of her son Maurice and his behaviour. Now a teenager, it wasn't just wine he was demanding, but absinthe. A vividly green aniseed spirit flavoured with wormwood, absinthe was the drink of the bohemian set, as it was thought to have all sorts of mind-expanding and hallucinogenic properties. Concerns about a unique type of mental illness it was believed to cause, absinthism, led to it being banned in France and most of Europe at the start of the First World War. And young Maurice was addicted. His rages became more violent, and Moussy and Suzanne consulted many different doctors and psychiatrists. Moussy tried to help by finding him work, but Maurice could not keep a job for more than a few days. Her worries came to a head in 1904, when Maurice was 21. During a particularly violent rage sparked by an antique pistol and powder being removed from his room, he rushed towards his mother with a knife. The police were called, and he was taken away and admitted to the Hôpital Sainte-Anne, the first of many such admissions. His psychiatrist, Henri Dagonet, noted that his Spanish father was an alcoholic, and his paternal grandmother had died by her own hand, which suggests that Utrillo was considered to be his real father. He had persecutory delusions and was thought to be in the early stages of démence précoce, or dementia praecox, the name used for schizophrenia at this time. But his history of dipsomania or alcoholism was also noted, and he improved and was discharged home after 4 months. At this point his mother thought he looked well. He was off alcohol, but he was very listless, avoiding everybody and sitting all day reading books. Worried that he would drift back into drinking, Suzanne suggested he take up painting as a hobby. Although reluctant at first, he soon wanted to do nothing else, and spent most of his time in his mother's studio in Montmartre. In 2 years he completed 150 paintings, and had a new purpose in his life. He still didn't like people, and preferred to shut himself away as he found them annoying. But he couldn't avoid everyone, and all too soon his drinking and angry rages returned. In 1909, Maurice was out painting one day, and was so drunk he could barely walk. A fellow artist, André Uter, saw him and helped him stagger home, and the two became friends, his only real friend, and he introduced him to his mother. Suzanne was 44, Uter was 23, 3 years younger than her son. But something happened, and Suzanne decided to walk away from her safe and comfortable life with Moussy, back to Montmartre, to set up home with Maurice and her new lover. They became known as le trio infernal, the infernal threesome, because of their noisy public quarrelling and riotous behaviour. During her time out of the city, Valadon had produced only a few drawings and paintings, but now she was back in the buzz of Montmartre. She made up for lost time. With Uter posing as Adam and herself as Eve, she produced a painting that shocked Paris. Male full frontals were simply too much, especially if painted by a woman, and she was forced to add some plumage to cover Adam's nakedness. She showed her work, the less controversial ones anyway, at the Salon d'Automne, an annual exhibition established as a reaction against the conservative policies of the official Paris Salon. And in 1911 she had her first solo exhibition at the gallery that first sold Picasso's work. She began painting nudes, some of models, some of herself, but they are very different from the standard titillating stuff so popular with bourgeois gentlemen. These are more honest, warts and all portrayals of women. Women without perfect bodies, women with dreams and regrets and worries for the future, real women rather than sex objects. And her work challenged traditional gender stereotypes, featuring men as objects of desire and a woman as consumer. Impressionism was gone, modernism was in, and she mixed with all the up-and-coming artists. Raoul Dufy, Georges Braque and Amedeo Modigliani were all frequent visitors to her studio, but she steadfastly refused to be cornered into any particular style or movement. In 1914, Maurice was in trouble again. He hit someone in the street with a saucepan and ended up back in hospital for 6 weeks. At the outbreak of the First World War, Utrillo, as a fit young man, had to join up, and he enlisted in the 158th Infantry Regiment. But he and Suzanne got married just before he left for the trenches to ensure she would receive an allowance as a soldier's wife. 1915 was a difficult year. Her mother died, her husband was away at the front, and the year ended with another long admission to hospital for Maurice, 10 months this time, with hallucinations and delusions. It was more than just alcoholism. In 1917, the Galerie Bertha Weil arranged a joint exhibition of her work alongside that of her husband and son. There was a lot of interest, especially in Maurice's Montmartre scenes, which show none of his inner turmoil. But also in 1917, in the Battle of the Hills, Utrillo was wounded in the shoulder and sent to an army convalescent centre at Belleville-sur-Saône. Suzanne rushed down to share the news about their increasing sales and look after him, and later they both looked back at this period as an idyllic 3 months. By the time Utrillo was finally released from the army in 1920, Suzanne was 54 years old and feeling that her looks were beginning to fade. She was desperate for attention and would dress and act in the strangest ways. She wanted Utrillo to worship her as he did in the early days of their romance. And when he was insufficiently effusive, she would be petulant and argumentative, and gradually the tiffs became more frequent, more acidic and more hurtful, and pushed him away. And whilst the popularity and prices of her work and the paintings of Maurice were increasing, Utrillo's work created less interest, and he became more of a manager for his wife and her son than a painter in his own right. It was a job he did very effectively, however, and in 1923 the Galerie Bernheim Jeune offered them a contract guaranteeing a minimum annual payment of 1,000,000 francs for all their future works. An enormous sum, $60,000 a year at the time, or well over $1 million today. The money allowed Suzanne to indulge her whims whenever she wanted. She took all the local children to the circus one day, threw 100-franc notes out of the window for passers-by to pick up. She got a taxi to drive for hundreds of miles so she could pick wild strawberries. She kept a pet goat in her studio and fed it any sketches she didn't like, and fed her cats caviar on Sundays. She also bought herself a nice little chateau overlooking the River Saône, with a separate studio for each of the 3 artists, where they held rowdy weekend parties for their friends and fellow artists. This was also the period when Suzanne, the former acrobat and model, found acceptance by the artistic establishment, both in Paris with her election to the Salon d'Automne and the Société des Artistes Indépendants, and internationally. But she didn't rest on her laurels and continued to create bold work that showed women as confident agents of their own destinies. In one of her most famous paintings, The Blue Room, a woman lounges on a bed like Manet's famous Olympia. But instead of advertising her sexual availability, Suzanne's reclining figure, dressed in striped pyjamas with a cigarette hanging from her lip, is advertising nothing. She is perfectly content. She doesn't want anything and doesn't care what anyone thinks, and the work has been hailed as an icon of early feminism. But Suzanne herself wasn't entirely content. The critical acclaim and financial success made her more self-centred and demanding. She expected adulation from Utrillo and continual assurance that she was a great artist. The tensions drove her husband to look elsewhere for affection, and this helped him for a while, but he eventually got bored and turned to drink instead, bemoaning his fate and declaring that nobody loved him. The more he drank, the more unpleasant and accusatorial he became. All Suzanne could do was throw herself into her work. By now, Maurice's paintings were commanding 4 or 5 times the price of hers. This didn't bother her, but the subjects in her paintings changed. The nudes gradually disappeared, to be replaced by still lifes and flowers. Her son's mental health was still a concern, however, and to try to keep him out of hospital, Suzanne took him to the chateau and employed a male nurse to look after him. She tended to all his needs, dressing him, feeding him, going for long walks with him, and sitting in a chair next to his at night until he fell asleep. She even had the idea of marrying him off to her husband's younger sister, but he wasn't interested. Utrillo would come down from Paris to visit, but he felt the Eden they had bought had been transformed into a living hell. Instead of peace and tranquillity, Maurice would run around screaming and shouting, followed by his mother fussing over him and trying to soothe him, but often making him worse. It was all too much, and in 1934 the couple divorced. Utrillo stayed alone in the chateau, and Suzanne moved back to Montmartre. The following year, Maurice married widow Lucie Valor, who took him away from Paris, and was able to reduce his drinking and help him achieve greater mental stability. But Suzanne didn't like her, and she suddenly found herself with no husband and a more distant relationship with her son, with her own health starting to fail. What was to become of the ageing wild child, wealthy beyond her wildest imaginings, but lonely, the queues of admirers long gone? The answer came in the form of another young aspiring artist, Gazi le Tartare, Gazi the Tartar. Originally from the Crimea, he had fled to Paris when the Bolsheviks took over, and he and Suzanne became unlikely friends. He moved in with her, but not as a lover. He looked after her like a devoted son, sitting and listening to her tales about Puvis de Chavannes, Renoir and Degas, and reinvigorating her enough to have a final burst of artistic activity. But in April 1938, sitting at her easel, painting a floral still life, she had a stroke. Neighbours heard her cry out and rushed in to help, but found her motionless on the floor. She survived the night, but died the following day. She was 72. Her daughter-in-law Lucie arranged the funeral as Maurice was in a state of collapse. The church of Saint-Pierre in her beloved Montmartre was packed, the crowds curious to see the famous painter and eccentric old lady begin her final journey. André Utrillo was there and was inconsolable, but the love of his life was at peace at last. With the Second World War and the new world of art after the war, Suzanne Valadon's name slowly faded. André Utrillo died in 1948 and her son in 1955. As for Suzanne herself having a mental health problem, despite being surrounded by people with alcoholism and neuropsychiatric conditions, her mother was a drinker, the father of her son was a drinker, and his mother ended her own life. Toulouse-Lautrec was a drinker who died at the age of 36 of syphilis. Degas suffered from depression, Erik Satie was on the autistic spectrum, and her son was in and out of mental hospitals with schizophrenia. Despite all of this, there is no evidence to suggest Suzanne herself had any serious mental health problems. She drank a bit and could be a prima donna at times, but this is hardly surprising given her traumatic start in life. Of course, there would have been those who uttered all sorts of derogatory labels under their breaths about her lifestyle, but for me, she was a survivor. A survivor of a mother who wasn't that interested, a survivor of a non-existent father, a survivor of war and starvation, a survivor of exploitation as a girl barely out of her childhood, a survivor of a society that was happy to look at pictures of naked women, but less happy to look at pictures painted by women with their clothes on. But more than a survivor, she triumphed, creating a body of work, 270 or so drawings and almost 500 paintings, that still makes a powerful statement today. And more recently, she's been picked up by feminist writers as a shining example of a woman who fought for and won respect for her art when few were able to do so. A few years before she died, when she was 66, she painted herself wearing nothing but a necklace. Gazing into a mirror, tired, careworn, perhaps with a few regrets, but with resignation and her fierce pride intact. She once said, "I can't flatter a subject," and for me it is this unflinching honesty that makes her work so unique and worthy of attention. Thank you for watching. I love this period of French culture, its art, its music, its literature, and I hope you enjoyed hearing about someone who isn't as well known as she deserves to be. If you're interested in her one-time lover Erik Satie, then I've done a video on him, and I'm planning a future video on another of her lovers, Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec. As always, I'd love to hear your views and any suggestions you may have for who I should tackle next. And if you're interested in supporting the channel and helping it grow, then we've just launched a membership, which you can click on below or in the description. But apart from that, I'll say goodbye for now, and I hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.